Chapter 8, Philo Farnsworth. There are certain inventions which, although not yet existent, we take for granted will be invented someday. Television, or remote seeing, is one such invention. Hugo Gernsback, Electrical Experimenter Magazine, 1918. Philo T. Farnsworth was born on August 19, 1906 in Indian Creek, Utah. His family was poor and moved frequently, searching for a better life. In 1918, as Hugo Gernsback predicted television, the three wagons of the Farnsworth family arrived at their new farmhouse in Rigby, Idaho. Philo was ecstatic to discover that, unlike their previous homes, this one had electricity. It was a pivotal moment in 12-year-old Philo's life. In a period that Edison himself called the Renaissance of invention, inventors were the idols that rock stars would be 50 years later, that tech founders are now. At age 6, Philo had announced to his family that he was going to be the next Edison. The contents of the new farmhouse attic put him on his way. Here, Philo discovered a stack of scientific magazines. They detailed the secrets of electronic devices with schematics and explanations on how to construct them. They also postulated theoretical inventions, many of which would come to pass in the coming years. In addition to the scientific journals, Farnsworth found magazines by Hugo Gernsback, the man widely considered to be the father of science fiction, whose visions of technology inspired both writers and inventors for decades. The scientific awards, the Hugos, are named after him to this day. One of Gernsback's themes intrigued Philo above all, the chaotic dream of television. Open quote. That such an invention is urgently required is needless to say. Everyone would wish to have such an instrument, and it is safe to say that such a device would revolutionize our present mode of living. Close quote. I was only 13 when I began studying the problem, Farnsworth would say later. It wasn't long before I realized that whoever solved it would make a fortune. The field. One night in 1920, 14-year-old Philo was plowing the field, thinking about various inventions, while he absent-mindedly brought the horses back and forth in rows. His eyes wandered along the field, lost in a dream. Then it hit him. The rows that he was plowing were alternating, reversing direction as the plow came around. One row was created left to right, the next from right to left, and each row was part of a larger canvas, sequentially building into a larger square. What if he could create a device that would mow electrons onto a screen as the plow mowed rows into the field? And what if the electrons refreshed the image faster than the eye could perceive? With the right kind of tube, you could do it. And Philo knew he could design that tube, modeled on things he had read about in the journals. That would be electronic television right there. In one intuitive leap, the 14-year-old vaulted over decades of thinking, past Nipkow, Baird, Jenkins, Alexander, Rossing, and others. But it was just an initial concept. To bring it to life, Philo needed a prototype. And to create a prototype, Philo desperately needed to supplement his science education in ways that the magazine simply could not do. So every day, after his morning chores, Philo went to Brigham Young High School early and begged science teacher Justin Tolman to let him into his class. At first, Tolman refused. Farnsworth had just moved into town and was pitifully behind. But eventually Tolman gave in and discovered that Farnsworth was the best student he'd ever had. When Philo asked questions hinting at his experiments, Tolman gave Philo a book on the cathode ray tube, which the boy devoured. At the end of the semester, Farnsworth asked Tolman for his opinion on something he was working on. He then filled the boards with a series of equations. Thunderstruck, Tolman asked what all of this meant. Farnsworth said it was his plan for creating electronic television. What should he do next? Tolman, beginning to see the implication, considered the boy's situation. He was David in the face of Goliath's RCA, AT&T, Westinghouse, and GE. he told Philo to keep studying and to tell nobody of his plans. The Farnsworths soon moved to Provo, where Philo attended Brigham Young University. In early 1924, his college time was cut short when his father died young. Farnsworth decided to join the Navy and went to Annapolis. But he soon faced a conflict. If he stayed in the Navy, the government would own his patents. That was off the table. Philo would never give away his inventions. Still, Farnsworth feared that he was running out of time. He left Annapolis and moved back to Utah, where he made a living as a radio repairman. By 1925, his fears were realized when Baird, Jenkins, and Alexanderson each made headlines with their versions of television. In the spring of 1926, Philo got a job working for two professional fundraisers, George Everson and Leslie Gorell. When Everson's car broke down, Philo picked it up from the mechanic and brought it back to town. He then proceeded to explain to Everson what the mechanic had done wrong. Impressed, Everson asked Philo about his future plans. Farnsworth told the men that he was raising funds to bring television to America. "Telly who?" said Everson. When Farnsworth explained, both men were skeptical, assuming that one or more of America's electronic giants must already be on the case. But Farnsworth won them over. Everson and Gorell gave Farnsworth $6,000 for equity in the new venture. During this period, Philo got engaged, then abandoned his new bride at their hotel on the wedding night to work on deal terms with Everson and Gorell. When he returned early in the morning, he made a confession. "Pemmy, I have to tell you there is another woman in my life, and her name is television." The lab. Soon, Farnsworth, Everson, and Gorell moved to Los Angeles to establish a lab in the entertainment capital of the country. Like many aspiring young people before and since, Farnsworth thought his arrival in Hollywood would be life-changing. It was not. Though he had some meetings, the studios paid him very little notice. Meetings at Caltech were more fruitful. One banker at Crocker National Bank opined, "This is a damn fool idea, but somebody ought to put money into it, somebody who can afford to lose it." Eventually, the Crocker Group itself backed Farnsworth. In 1926, the Farnsworth Group established the Crocker Research Laboratory in San Francisco. Crocker First National put up $25,000, over $300,000 today. And in 1927, Farnsworth submitted a patent application for electronic television. Although it was filed 4 years after Zworykin's, it had the benefit of being backed by actual prototypes. Philo became the first inventor to transmit moving images by electronic television. Like Morse and Bell before him, he immediately sent a message. His telegram read, "The damn thing works!" As the Roaring Twenties progressed, buzz increased around the idea of television. The New York Times speculated on the fortune awaiting whoever won the race. In 1928, Farnsworth cast aside Tolman's words of caution. The company needed money and publicity would bring it. So Philo unveiled his invention to the world. The San Francisco Chronicle soon heralded its new local hero with the headline, "SF Man's Invention to Revolutionize Television." Open quote. Farnsworth electronic system employs no moving parts whatsoever. Instead of moving the machine, he varies the electronic current that plays over the image and thus gets the necessary scanning. The system is thus simple in the extreme, and one of the major mechanical obstacles to the perfection of television is thereby removed. Close quote. Media coverage spread. Farnsworth was extolled as the new Marconi. Though his patents had not yet been granted, his lawyers were optimistic. But in 1928, as the experiments went on, Crocker decided not to extend further funding to Farnsworth. So in the manner of many startups, the lab crew began working more or less for free. Then, in August of 1930, Philo Farnsworth got his patent approval. Farnsworth versus Zworykin. "This is a beautiful instrument. I wish that I might have invented it." Vladimir Zworykin to Philo Farnsworth. A few months prior to getting his patent, Farnsworth received exciting news. Vladimir Zworykin himself wanted to meet. Farnsworth was jubilant. He had been following news on Zworykin's cathode ray tube experiments and thought Zworykin might be bringing him funding from his company, Westinghouse. Farnsworth knew he'd need deep pockets for a potential patent battle with RCA. In a now legendary show of openness, Philo hosted Zworykin for 3 days. He had Zworykin over for dinner, introduced him to his wife, and showed his competitor the full contents of his laboratory. Zworykin took copious notes, especially concerning Farnsworth's crown jewel, the image dissector tube. This was Philo's version of the picture tube, and it was light years ahead of Zworykin's version. When he saw it, Zworykin commented tellingly, "I wish I might have invented it." Arguments have raged for decades about that 3-day tour. Skeptics say that Farnsworth was hopelessly naive, opening his shop for an enemy to plunder. Farnsworth himself responded that it had been a calculated risk. He needed the capital desperately, and Zworykin's Westinghouse was the best bet he had. What Farnsworth could not know was that Zworykin wasn't representing Westinghouse anymore. Zworykin said goodbye to Farnsworth, took a train back to Westinghouse, and dictated a 700-word memo on the way, describing a device he wanted his lab staff to build. When he arrived, the device was ready. It was Zworykin's version of the image dissector tube. In 1933, Zworykin created his first working television system. It was very different from what he'd previously described. The new system was much more like the systems built by Farnsworth. Then Zworykin packed up his office, left Westinghouse forever, and prepared to start his new job for Sarnoff at RCA. Sarnoff and Zworykin. At their first meeting in 1929, Zworykin had pitched Sarnoff on the idea of electronic television. When Sarnoff asked Zworykin how much it would cost, Zworykin said he would need $100,000. His estimate was off by about $50 million, but by then it didn't matter. In Zworykin, Sarnoff saw an Armstrong that he could manage. What's most intriguing is that Sarnoff, the most powerful man in radio, had already gone to see the Farnsworth lab himself. He had done it in one of the worst periods of his life, as the Depression was bringing RCA to its knees. At the time of the visit, according to Alex Magoon, director of the David Sarnoff Library, quote, RCA was in chaos. Radio and phonograph sales were plunging. The Depression led to a price war and the $10 radio. The government forced RCA to slash its license fees, and RCA's stock lost more than 90% of its value. Sarnoff had this desperation. He was probably thinking, I'm going to buy this Farnsworth guy. Close quote. For reasons never fully explained, when the most powerful man in the media business came to see him, Philo Farnsworth was not there. Investor George Everson gave Sarnoff the tour, after which Sarnoff went home. Sarnoff eventually offered Everson and Farnsworth $100,000 in exchange for all of Philo's patents, for the Crocker Research Lab, and for Farnsworth's services as an employee, the same amount he had initially gave Zworykin. It was less than Everson and Farnsworth had built up in debt, and they rejected the offer. But there's no evidence that they made any attempts to negotiate a better deal. It's not clear how Farnsworth thought Sarnoff would take the rejection, but anyone who paid attention to Sarnoff would have known that the rejection would be taken as an act of war. Deep in debt, with no source of funding, Farnsworth knew he was in trouble, but he would not give in.